January 9, 1943. Just before dawn, as the first pale light crept over the vast Pacific horizon, touching the waves with a faint silver glow that shimmered like a waking giant beneath the sky, the war in the Pacific shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, though neither Japan nor the United States fully understood, in that fragile hour before sunrise, that a new kind of strategy was being born, one that would unravel empires, topple fortresses, and redraw the very meaning of conquest. The humid air hung heavy over the waters stretching between Australia and the Japanese-held islands of the Solomons, and in the dim early light, American officers aboard the command ships studied maps illuminated by lantern glow, lines drawn across charts like arteries of an unfolding plan, while radios buzzed with coded messages describing Japanese troop positions, weather forecasts, and the movements of supply convoys threading through the coral seas. 4 months, the brutal fighting at Guadalcanal had devoured thousands of lives, revealing the terrifying strength of Japan's defensive resolve. American commanders saw clearly now that if the United States tried to seize every island in the Pacific, every fortified ridge, every volcanic outpost, every jungle-covered rock bristling with gun emplacements, the war would stretch for years, perhaps decades, and the cost in blood would be unimaginable. So, in these early hours of 1943, as the ocean breathed softly beneath the rising sun, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur each came to the same realization. America needed a new way to fight. They needed not the slow grind of traditional invasion, but something fluid, something cunning, something Japan would never anticipate. And so the idea crystallized, a strategy the world would one day call island hopping. It began with a question so simple that, in the vast machinery of war, its elegance felt almost poetic. Why attack where the enemy is strongest? Why assault Rabaul, a fortress with more guns, airfields, tunnels, and defenders than perhaps any Japanese base outside the homeland? Why hurl Marines against islands carved into labyrinths of bunkers and caves, defended by soldiers trained from birth to die for the Emperor? Why attempt to storm every island in a chain stretching thousands of miles across the ocean? Instead, the Americans would choose, selectively, surgically, relentlessly, striking where Japan was weak, avoiding where Japan was strongest, bypassing entire armies that would be left behind to rot in isolation, starved of food, fuel, medicine, ammunition, and reinforcement. And as the morning light grew brighter, washing across the decks of carriers poised for their next operation, the seeds of this revolutionary strategy began taking root. Meanwhile, on the Japanese-held islands, the garrisons woke to another humid, suffocating day beneath the tropical sun, unaware that the war around them was already changing. In Rabaul's underground command bunkers, hewn out of volcanic stone so thick not even the largest bombs could penetrate, Japanese officers studied reports of American movements with confidence. Their defensive perimeter was strong, they believed. Their outposts were fortified. Their bunkers were deep. Their artillery was concealed in cliffs, caves, and camouflaged nests invisible from the sky. Tokyo believed these outposts would force America to fight inch by inch, beach by bloody beach, draining the invader until the United States eventually negotiated peace on Japan's terms. But what the Japanese High Command could not see, trapped inside their assumptions, was that their greatest strength would soon become their greatest weakness. A fortress is only powerful if the enemy chooses to attack it. And America would not. While Japanese engineers dug tunnels, laid mines, and prepared for invasions that would never come, American reconnaissance planes scouted lightly defended islands, places with airfields that could be seized quickly, ports that could support fleets, locations that offered stepping stones across the Pacific like a path laid over water. On this January morning, one of those reconnaissance flights discovered something extraordinary. The weakly defended island of Amby in the New Hebrides, sitting like an overlooked gem in the vast ocean, within reach of both American bombers and Japanese supply routes. It was a place Japan considered too insignificant to fortify heavily. But in war, insignificance can become opportunity. And island hopping, at its core, was the art of turning overlooked islands into strategic daggers pointed at the enemy's heart. As the sun climbed higher, turning the Pacific from silver to a deep crystal blue, American carriers launched aircraft, Hellcats and Avengers that soared into the sky with engines roaring like a rising storm. Their mission was simple yet revolutionary. Identify the islands Japan did not expect America to want, the ones Japan could not reinforce easily, the ones whose capture would isolate more important, heavily defended positions like Rabaul, Truk, and Kavieng. It was a strategy of starving rather than storming, of choosing the battlefield rather than accepting it. And the Japanese had absolutely no answer for it. In many of the fortified islands, morale was high. Japanese commanders believed America would come to them sooner or later. After all, that was the logical path of war. An enemy must attack the strong points. An invader must break down the walls. So garrisons trained relentlessly, prepared ambush positions deep in the jungle, built intersecting fields of fire, and rehearsed the final banzai charges that would greet the Americans on the beaches. But as the days passed, something strange occurred. The Americans didn't come. At first, the Japanese assumed delays, weather complications, or diversions. But then reports arrived, shocking, confusing, alarming, that Americans were landing elsewhere. Simultaneously, rapidly, purposefully. They weren't touching the heavily defended islands at all. They were skipping them entirely. On Bougainville, where Japanese troops numbered nearly 40,000, American landings bypassed the strongest positions, coming ashore in remote areas instead. In the Marshall Islands, instead of invading the massive garrison on watch, the Americans seized Roina Moor and Kwajalein, cutting off watch supply lines until the garrison slowly starved. At Tarawa, a costly battle had shown America the price of assaulting a heavily defended island head-on. The lesson was clear. Why take 3,000 casualties for a few square miles of coral sand when you could bypass such islands entirely? Why waste Marines on fortresses destined to wither in isolation? American strategists realized that Japan's defensive perimeter, so wide, so ambitious, so resource-draining, was also vulnerable to being sliced apart by choosing where not to fight. And so the U.S. Navy, the Marines, and the Army began coordinating a strategy unlike anything seen before. Hop from island to island across a span of thousands of miles, establishing airfields to extend bomber range, building ports to supply the next leap, and letting bypassed Japanese garrisons crumble into irrelevance. Tokyo received reports from isolated garrisons describing dwindling supplies, vanishing convoys, and strange American landings far from expected targets. But Japan's commanders refused at first to believe the scale of what was unfolding. They assumed the Americans were making mistakes. They assumed these irregular operations were merely temporary diversions. But then came the moment that shattered that illusion, the bypassing of Rabaul, the greatest Japanese fortress outside the home islands. Rabaul, the jewel of Japan's Pacific defense, the headquarters of their air power in the region, the citadel from which they intended to strike at Australia and dominate the South Pacific, was suddenly irrelevant. American reconnaissance revealed something astonishing. Japan had poured so many troops, aircraft. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. Guns and supplies into Rabaul that the fortress itself could no longer move. It was too heavy, too fortified, too dependent on constant resupply. And America realized that trying to invade such a fortress would cost tens of thousands of lives. So the Americans did something Japan had not even considered a possibility. They ignored it. They severed its supply lines by capturing nearby islands. They used carriers to strike at its airfields. They isolated Rabaul until its soldiers, once feared as some of the most elite in the Pacific, were reduced to eating what little food could be grown in the volcanic soil. Rabaul became a prison, massive, fortified, and completely useless. Not a single American soldier needed to die taking it. As more islands fell, a pattern emerged, one so consistent and so devastating that Japanese commanders began to realize too late, what was happening. Wherever America struck, they did so with overwhelming force. Naval gunfire, bombers, marines, engineering units ready to carve airfields from coral in days. Wherever America didn't strike, they starved the island instead, leaving its garrison trapped, unsupported, powerless. And by the time Japanese strategists understood the genius of the plan, the Americans were already advancing beyond the outer defensive ring, seizing the Marshall Islands, then the Marianas, bringing Saipan and Tinian within bomber range of Tokyo. The Japanese military, once confident in its web of fortified islands, found itself caught in a strategy designed to unravel that web strand by strand. But the genius of island hopping wasn't just in bypassing strong points. It was in building a new network of American bases faster than Japan could react. On every island America captured, engineers swarmed ashore with bulldozers, cranes, and construction equipment, carving runways from the earth in days, not weeks. Soon B-24 Liberators and B-29 superfortresses soared across the Pacific, using newly built airfields as stepping stones toward Japan's heartland. Japanese supply convoys were cut apart by submarines whose hunting grounds expanded with every American advance. The ocean Japan had once controlled now belonged to the United States. And as the first days of 1943 unfolded into weeks, and weeks into months, the scale of the transformation approached something Japan had never imagined. The Pacific, once a vast ocean that protected their empire, was shrinking, compressing into a narrow corridor leading directly toward the homeland. And on this quiet January morning, as America launched reconnaissance flights and Japan prepared for invasions that would never come, the first threads of the strategy that would decide the fate of the Pacific were quietly being woven together, thread by thread, decision by decision, landing by landing, forming the unstoppable blueprint for victory that Japan, for all its preparation, all its fortifications, all its sacrifices, never saw coming. February 5, 1943, late in the afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the Solomon Sea and the wind shifted with the heavy, electric tension that often preceded a tropical downpour, the American High Command finalized the next phase of their strategy, unaware that this day would mark the moment Japan began to feel the weight of a war they no longer fully understood. On the decks of the USS Enterprise, sailors moved quickly beneath the thickening clouds, securing aircraft and preparing for the next wave of reconnaissance flights, while inside the ship's map rooms, officers traced new lines across the Pacific, marking routes that curved not toward the enemy's strongest defenses but around them, snaking through the ocean in patterns that defied everything traditional military doctrine had ever taught. For generations, war had been fought through brute collision, army against army, fortress against invader, strength against strength, but island hopping rewrote the rules entirely. The Americans were now choosing their battles with surgical precision, focusing not on enemy strongholds, but on the supply arteries that fed them. And as the storm rolled in, drenching the carrier decks with warm sheets of rain, the U.S. Navy's actions were already setting in motion a slow, crushing suffocation of Japan's Pacific Empire. Far across the ocean, deep within the humid jungles of the Gilbert Islands, Japanese soldiers patrolled their defensive positions unaware that the war around them was shifting away, that the front line was no longer the beaches they watched so carefully, but the sea lanes now hunted relentlessly by American submarines. These narrow arteries of supply, once flowing steadily between Japan and its scattered garrisons, were thinning as U.S. submarines ambushed convoy after convoy, sinking transports, fuel ships, and ammunition carriers with torpedoes that streaked silently through the depths before exploding beneath Japanese hulls in orange bursts of fire that lit the sky. And with each convoy destroyed, with each ship dragged down into the dark, icy silence of the ocean floor, another Japanese outpost found itself starving, cut off, forgotten. By mid-February, isolated garrisons began sending frantic radio messages to their headquarters. Supplies low. Medical shortages. Enemy bypassed our island. Request instruction. But Tokyo had no answers, no reinforcements, no way to comprehend how quickly the Americans were advancing. And even as Japanese commanders clung to their maps filled with red circles marking proudly defended islands, they failed to see the growing truth written in the space between those islands. America was turning the Pacific into a highway, one they were paving with airfields and sheltered anchorages carved from newly captured territory. Their bases multiplied like stepping stones across a river. Their bombers reached farther each month. Their fleets, once cautious and defensive after Pearl Harbor, now moved with the confidence of a power that understood it had seized the initiative. And all the while, Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands continued drilling, digging, preparing for invasions that would never come. February 19, 1943, just before midnight, a Japanese lookout on the island of Kolombangara spotted flashes of lightning far out at sea. At first, he assumed it was nature's fury or distant gunfire from some small skirmish. Only later did he learn the truth. Those flashes marked a new American landing, not on Kolombangara, where 10,000 Japanese troops waited in fortified positions, but on the lightly defended Russell Islands to the east. Kolombangara's garrison, fully prepared for a massive, bloody clash, sat helpless as the Americans simply ignored them, landing instead where they could build airfields without resistance. The shock rippled through Japanese command like a cold wind. If America was not attacking the strong points, what were they planning? The answer came quickly and painfully. As soon as the Americans secured the Russell Islands, engineering battalions flooded the beaches, bulldozers roaring through the trees, carving runways out of the jungle with impossible speed. Within days, fighters and bombers were taking off from those runways, striking Kolombangara from the air, cutting supply lines, and isolating the Japanese troops entirely. Those 10,000 men, once considered an immovable pillar of Japan's defense, were suddenly stranded, irrelevant, bypassed, transformed from warriors into prisoners of their own island. And yet this was only the beginning. The Americans now understood the rhythm of the Pacific, the pulse of supply, the vulnerabilities of distance, the weaknesses of Japan's overextended empire. They were moving faster than Japan could react, choosing objectives Japan had not prepared for, turning the Japanese commanders into spectators watching a war they no longer controlled. March 3, 1943 noon, the tropical sun beating mercilessly down on the waters of the Bismarck Sea. American aircraft swarmed over a massive Japanese convoy attempting to resupply La and Salamaua in New Guinea. Bombs fell like steel rain, torpedoes streaked through the water, and the sky turned black with smoke as ship after ship burst into flames. In a single day, hundreds of Japanese soldiers drowned, burned, or vanished beneath the waves, and with them sank Japan's ability to reinforce the vital New Guinea front. American crews returned to their bases jubilant but exhausted, their faces coated in sweat and oil, unaware that this one battle would accelerate the success of island hopping more than any other. For without supplies, without reinforcements, without fuel or munitions, Japan's island garrisons were doomed, rotting from the inside long before American boots ever stepped ashore. Inside Japan's military headquarters, urgent meetings erupted. Admirals pored over maps. Generals demanded explanations. How were the Americans advancing so quickly? Why were heavily fortified islands being bypassed? How could so many soldiers be stranded? The answers were slow to come, clouded by outdated assumptions, pride, and the belief that Japan's defensive perimeter was unbreakable. But slowly, painfully, the truth dawned on them. America was not fighting the war Japan expected. They weren't attacking strong points. They weren't walking into traps. They weren't fighting the way Japan had trained for. Instead, the U.S. was tearing at the seams of the empire itself, isolating segments, unraveling connections, turning islands into starving tombs. By the time Japanese strategists grasped the full scope of this strategy, it was already too late. The Americans were moving on to the next target, New Georgia, a jungle-covered island whose capture would push the U.S. closer to Rabaul, the fortress Japan considered the crown jewel of its Pacific empire. June 30, 1943, dawn, amphibious craft churned through the water toward New Georgia, their engines humming beneath a pastel sky streaked with pink and gold as the rising sun cast long shadows across the coastline. Marines crouched inside the landing craft, gripping their rifles, sweat already forming on their brows in the oppressive heat. But as they hit the beaches, they discovered something unusual. The Japanese defenses were weaker than expected. Not because Japan lacked men, they had thousands stationed on nearby islands, but because those forces were now trapped, isolated, unable to reach New Georgia due to America's growing control of the sea and sky. Japanese commanders, once proud of their interlocking island defenses, now watched helplessly as America shattered that web, turning once formidable strongholds into disconnected pockets of resistance. Meanwhile, American engineers wasted no time. As soon as the beaches were secure, they surged forward with bulldozers, explosives, and steel tracks, carving airfields from the rugged terrain. New Georgia became another stepping stone, another link in the chain pulling America ever closer to the Philippines, and eventually to Japan itself. And still, Japan could not understand how their mighty outer ring was collapsing without the decisive battles they expected. They had prepared for heroic stands, for mountain defenses, for suicide charges, for battles that would echo through history with the fury of warriors meeting their fate. But island hopping robbed them of the very war they had prepared to fight. Their fortresses went unused. Their bunkers saw no attackers. Their ambushes were never triggered. Their armies sat and waited as the war simply passed them by. August 7, 1943, late evening, the sun sinking behind the jagged silhouette of Bougainville as the sky glowed orange over the Pacific, American commanders executed another leap in the unstoppable chain. They chose to invade the. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. Lightly defended western coast of Bougainville instead of the heavily fortified southern region. Japanese soldiers stationed in the south, tens of thousands of them, watched in disbelief as American infantry landed miles away. Their powerful positions, their artillery emplacements, their cliffs bristling with defenses, all of it suddenly useless. American troops built airfields on Bougainville with the same relentless speed, and soon the skies were filled with Allied bombers striking Rabaul, reducing the once glorious fortress to a burned-out shell. Japan's greatest stronghold in the South Pacific, home to over 100,000 troops, was now trapped, isolated, unable to escape or fight back, bombed daily until the soldiers within lived in caves, starving, abandoned by Tokyo's shrinking supply lines. And the Americans had done it without a direct invasion, without sacrificing tens of thousands of lives, without fighting the battle Japan had spent years preparing for. September 15, 1943, early morning, as American ships sailed past the eastern New Guinea coastline, carriers launched airstrikes on smaller Japanese outposts, softening them for the next leap in the chain. Marines studied their maps, realizing just how far they had come. A year earlier, Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific like an unbroken wall. Now, that wall was cracked, splintered, collapsing under the pressure of a strategy Japan had never accounted for. And as the sun rose higher, illuminating the deck of every carrier, destroyer, and transport vessel sailing toward the next objective, a quiet truth settled over the American ranks. They were winning, not through sheer force, not through massive battles, but through intelligence, precision, and adaptability. The Pacific, once a vast ocean under Japanese control, now felt smaller, narrower, shrinking with every island America seized. And Japan, once confident in its defensive perimeter, now found itself overwhelmed, outmaneuvered, and slowly suffocating. The empire was unraveling, not with a dramatic clash, not with a single decisive battle, but through a steady, relentless strategy that Japan, for all its strength and resolve, had never imagined possible. And as the final days of September bled into October, with American forces preparing their next leap forward, the truth became undeniable across Tokyo's war rooms. Island hopping was not merely a strategy. It was the silent weapon that would bring the empire to its knees. October 11, 1943, just before sunrise, as a pale silver light crept across the restless waters north of New Guinea, and the sky shifted from deep violet to soft grey, American scout planes soared through the cool morning air, mapping the next target in a campaign that was grinding Japan's Pacific Empire into isolation one island at a time. The men aboard those aircraft had no idea that this day, this mission, would mark the opening moves of a strategic transformation that would push Japan into a corner. So tight that not even its most hardened commanders could imagine a way out. But as the planes flew low over the coral reefs and twisting jungle canopy of the Admiralty Islands, the truth became clear. The Japanese defensive perimeter, once thought impregnable, was now full of gaps. Below them, Japanese soldiers moved sluggishly through their coastal outposts, unaware that they had already been rendered strategically irrelevant. Many of these garrisons had not seen supplies in weeks, their rice rations reduced to handfuls, their uniforms tattered, their morale battered by constant hunger and the distant growl of American aircraft that now owned the skies. And yet, high-ranking Japanese officers in Rabaul still believed they could hold back the American tide, still believed their fortified islands, pillars of a defensive wall stretching thousands of miles, would force the United States into the kind of brutal, bloody slog that would break their resolve. But island hopping had shattered that illusion. America no longer needed to storm every fortress. They simply had to leapfrog the strong ones, starve them, and turn them into empty monuments of an empire that no longer controlled its own destiny. October 17, 1943, early afternoon, Admiral William Bull Halsey stood aboard the USS New Jersey, the wind ripping across the deck as he studied the latest intelligence reports. His staff briefed him on Japanese troop numbers, supply shortages, and communications intercepts that revealed a growing panic among Japanese commanders. Halsey understood what few in Washington had grasped at the beginning of the war. Victory in the Pacific would not come from meeting strength with strength, but from attacking weakness at its most vulnerable points. And so, he circled the Admiralty Islands on the map, not because they held large Japanese forces, but because they offered an airfield location that would shorten the distance to the Philippines. Japan viewed the islands as unimportant. America viewed them as a key to the next leap. The strategy was working so perfectly that even American officers found themselves whispering in disbelief at the speed of the advance. The Pacific, once dominated by Japan's sweeping empire, was transforming into a network of American staging grounds, each island a launch pad for the next. And like dominoes, the Japanese defensive line was falling, not through brute force, but through quiet abandonment, through starvation, through the slow suffocation of garrisons that waited for reinforcements that would never arrive. November 1, 1943, late morning, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Cape Torokina on Bougainville. The Japanese defenders believed the Americans would attack the southern end of the island, where their artillery and bunkers formed an iron wall. But the Americans, following their growing pattern, landed where the Japanese were weakest. The shock among Japanese commanders was immediate. Messages raced through Rabaul, officers shouting for reinforcements, generals demanding explanations. Why hadn't the Americans attacked the fortified zones? Why had they chosen a swampy, undeveloped landing site? How did they know it was weakly defended? The answers eluded them. Their entire war doctrine, built on predicting enemy movements, anticipating assaults on strong points, funneling attackers into deadly traps, crumbled before their eyes. American engineering teams rammed through the swamps at an astonishing pace, carving out an airfield even as Japanese artillery thundered from distant ridges. Within weeks, American bombers were lifting off from Bougainville, aiming their payloads at Japan's largest stronghold in the Pacific, Rabaul. Once considered the heart of Japan's southern army, Rabaul was now being pounded daily from an island Japan never expected the Allies to take. And as smoke rose from the shattered base, Japanese commanders began to grasp the horror of the strategy unraveling their empire. Everything they had built was being bypassed. Their best troops were fighting battles that no longer mattered. Their strongest fortresses were being left behind, isolated, shrinking into irrelevance. November 21, 1943 dawn, the American fleet launched the invasion of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. Unlike the bypassed strongholds, Tarawa was assaulted directly, but only because it was needed as a stepping stone for aircraft. Even this battle, the bloodiest amphibious assault the Americans had faced so far, served the logic of island hopping. Secure airfields, skip the rest, and move on. Tarawa's defenders fought with ferocity, turning beaches red with the blood of Marines who stumbled ashore under withering fire. Yet, as tragic as the losses were, the aftermath revealed a brutal truth for Japan. If Tarawa, one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Central Pacific, could fall in 76 hours, then no island was safe. News of Tarawa reached Japanese commanders like a funeral bell. If America could take Tarawa, the Marshalls were next. And the Marshalls were not ready. January 29, 1944 night, under the faint glow of the moon, the American fleet approached the Marshall Islands in silence. But instead of attacking the well-defended stronghold of Watch, or the massive fortress at Malalap, or the deadly garrisons bristling with guns on Jalawat, the Americans made their boldest move yet. They simply skipped them. They struck Kwajalein and Majuro, two locations Japan had assumed were safe because they were not the primary defensive hubs. In the early hours of the assault, Japanese commanders were stunned into disbelief. How could the Americans have chosen these islands? Why these? Why now? Island hopping had evolved into something even sharper, a psychological blade slicing through Japan's expectations. Every time Japan prepared for a frontal assault, the Americans sidestepped. Every time Japan strengthened a fortification, the Americans ignored it. Every time Japan predicted their movements, the Americans moved elsewhere. Kwajalein fell quickly. Majuro fell without a fight. And suddenly, American bombers could strike deep into the heart of the Marshall Chain, pummeling Japanese bases that had never anticipated being bypassed. Within weeks, the fortresses Japan had poured so many resources into were reduced from vital defensive points to isolated tombs where soldiers starved slowly in bunkers, their radios falling silent one by one. February 17, 1944, noon, American carriers unleashed one of the largest air assaults of the war against Truk, Japan's equivalent of Pearl Harbor, a massive naval base believed to be untouchable. Dozens of Japanese ships were sunk or crippled. Airfields burned. Fuel tanks erupted in towering columns of flame. Pilots who survived the raid reported seeing Japanese aircraft trying to take off from flaming runways, smoke rolling across the fields in black waves. This blow was more than military. It was spiritual. Truk had been the pride of Japan's navy, a symbol of its reach and power. To see it shattered in a single attack shook even the most loyal officers to their core. And as the flames rose from the ruins, the Japanese High Command finally realized something they had refused to see. Island hopping was not just a series of landings. It was a strategy designed to gut the empire from the inside. Every bypassed island became a grave. Every isolated garrison became a ghost. Every step the Americans took made Japan's once mighty perimeter more meaningless. March 10, 1944, early morning, American commanders met aboard the USS Bunker Hill to finalize the next leap, the capture of the Marianas. This chain of islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, lay close enough to Japan that American bombers launched from there could strike the home islands. To Japan, the Marianas were sacred ground. To America, they were the key to ending the war. But even as Japan prepared massive defenses on Saipan, they couldn't reinforce the island effectively. Their supply ships were being sunk. Their aircraft were being destroyed before they reached the front. Their garrisons on nearby islands sat starving. The empire was collapsing from hunger, exhaustion, and disconnection. And the Americans had engineered that collapse through a strategy so deceptively simple that Japan never imagined it could work. Don't attack strength. Attack weakness. Don't bleed for every island. Leap past them. Don't destroy every garrison. Starve them. By the time the sun set on that March evening, casting long shadows across the decks of the American fleet. The truth was undeniable across both sides of the Pacific. The US was no longer trying to win the war the traditional way. They were dismantling Japan's empire piece by piece, step by step, island by island, without ever facing the full force of its defenses. And as American ships turned north toward their next objective, the Japanese commanders stared helplessly at maps that no longer reflected reality. Their empire had become a chain of dead islands, surrounded by American airfields, choked by American submarines, overshadowed by American bombers. The war they had prepared for was gone. A new war, a war of starvation, isolation, and psychological collapse, had taken its place. And Japan had no answer for it. June 11, 1944. Early in the morning, as a warm Pacific wind drifted over the vast blue expanse between the Marshall Islands and the Marianas, the American fleet moved forward in silence, its decks shimmering beneath the first gold streaks of sunrise, aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip like rows of sharpened arrows aimed directly at the heart of Japan's empire. Sailors moved across the decks with deliberate efficiency, tightening cables, checking fuel lines, loading bombs beneath wings that would soon carry death across hundreds of miles. Below deck, Marines sat in rows, their helmets resting on their knees, their faces reflecting the weight of what lay ahead. They knew the target was different this time. These were not minor atolls or forgotten outposts. They were heading toward the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the islands Japan considered the inner barrier of the empire, the defensive ring that stood between the Americans and the home islands. And as they drew closer, the air felt charged with a tension unlike anything the Pacific had seen before. Island hopping had brought them here with surgical precision, skipping fortresses, starving outposts, outmaneuvering entire armies. But now, the Americans were preparing to drive a spear straight into Japan's strategic heart. June 12, 1944. Late afternoon, aboard the flagship USS Indianapolis, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the maps laid across his war table. A circle drawn around Saipan represented the range of the new B-29 superfortress. If the Marianas fell, America could bomb Tokyo itself. This realization was not lost on Japan. Across the sea, deep within Tokyo's military headquarters, Japanese commanders pored over their own maps in frantic disbelief. The Americans were advancing too quickly, too efficiently, too unpredictably. Their submarines, now swarming the Pacific like silent predators, were sinking Japanese supply ships faster than they could be built. Their bombers were destroying Japanese airfields faster than they could be repaired. Their carriers extended their reach across thousands of miles, striking without warning, leaving entire bases smoldering in ruins. And their troops were no longer slogging through impossible battles. They were leaping, weaving, choosing when to fight, and when not to. Japan had never prepared for such a war. June 15, 1944. Dawn. The horizon erupted in thunder as thousands of shells arced through the sky, slamming into Saipan's coastline with earth-shaking force. Battleships unleashed their firepower, turning beaches into plumes of smoke and molten sand. Cruisers added their own barrage, tearing apart bunkers and trench lines. 4 hours, the bombardment continued, shaking the very island until the land itself seemed to tremble in agony. When the shells finally ceased, the landing craft surged forward, carrying Marines toward the smoke-choked shoreline. But unlike the bypass strategies used on earlier islands, Saipan could not be skipped. It was too important, too close to Japan, too vital to the war's outcome. The Japanese defenders, 32,000 strong, waited in fortified positions, prepared to fight to the last breath. The beaches ran red in the opening hours, Marines falling under machine gun fire from cliffs and hidden bunkers. Bodies floated in the surf as waves washed over them, staining the water crimson. Yet, even as casualties mounted, the Americans pressed forward, driven by a grim determination carved into their souls since Pearl Harbor. And behind them, The machinery of island hopping continued its cold, unstoppable rhythm. While the Marines fought on the ground, American carrier pilots destroyed Japanese reinforcements attempting to reach the island. Submarines lurked beneath the waves, torpedoing any ship that dared approach. Aircraft from captured islands provided constant air cover. Saipan was not just a battle. It was a demonstration of how far American strategy had evolved. The Americans were not fighting alone. They were fighting as part of a vast, interlocking machine of naval, aerial, and logistical superiority Japan could no longer comprehend. June 19, 1944. Midday, the battle expanded beyond the shores of Saipan. Japanese carriers, desperate to stop the American advance, launched the largest air assault they had attempted since the early days of the war. Hundreds of aircraft roared toward the American fleet, their pilots determined to break the enemy once and for all. But what followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a brutal, one-sided massacre in which American fighter pilots shot down Japanese planes by the dozens, their superior training, radar coordination, and aircraft giving them an unprecedented advantage. Many Japanese pilots, rushed into service with little training and flying outdated aircraft, were cut down before they even saw the enemy. Flaming wrecks plunged from the sky like burning comets. Parachutes bloomed across the horizon like white flowers drifting in the wind. Too few, too late. When the battle ended, Japan had lost over 300 aircraft. Their once mighty carrier aviation, pride of the Imperial Navy, was effectively destroyed. And with it, Japan lost the ability to defend the Pacific. Carrier decks lay empty. Pilots were dead. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. The Empire's lifelines were severed. And still, the ground battle on Saipan raged. June 22, 1944. Twilight. The sinking sun turning the sky blood-red, American troops finally broke through the central defensive line. Japanese officers, recognizing the inevitable, began preparing for the final act, a banzai charge so large and desperate that it would be etched into history as one of the most tragic moments of the war. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many wounded, many starving, many barely able to stand, assembled for one last assault. Officers shouted prayers. Medics handed rifles to men too weak to hold them. Some carried bayonets tied to bamboo poles. Others clutched grenades in shaking hands. And when the order came, they surged forward, screaming, charging across fields already soaked with blood. The Americans, hardened by days of brutal fighting, held the line with machine guns, mortars, and rifles. The ground shook under the weight of the assault. Men collided in hand-to-hand combat. Faces twisted in fear, fury, and sorrow. By dawn, the charge had ended. The survivors lay scattered across the battlefield like fallen shadows. Saipan was all but secured. And with its fall, the American airfields began taking shape. Massive runways capable of launching the B-29s that would bring the war directly to Japan's doorstep. July 9, 1944, morning, American forces raised their flag over Saipan. Across the Pacific, the psychological blow struck Tokyo with the force of an earthquake. For the first time in the war, the Japanese people felt the approaching breath of defeat. Inside the imperial palace, whispers spread through the corridors. Government ministers exchanged fearful glances. The Prime Minister resigned in disgrace, and Emperor Hirohito, usually shielded from military details, was briefed personally on the catastrophic loss. But while Japan reeled from Saipan's fall, America moved forward again. July 21, 1944, morning, Marines and Army troops assaulted Guam, another step in the chain bringing them ever closer to the Philippines. Japanese defenders fought savagely, knowing the island was part of their homeland's final shield. But as with every battle now, they were fighting against overwhelming odds. Cut off, starving, low on ammunition, bombarded from air and sea. Guam fell within weeks. By August, Tinian fell as well, and the runways on Tinian and Saipan began to hum with activity. Hundreds of B-29 bombers assembling each day, their engines rumbling across the island like thunder rolling through the earth. American engineers carved those runways with mathematical precision, knowing what Japan did not yet understand. These islands would host the aircraft that would end the war. September 1, 1944, afternoon, as the first B-29s tested their range over the Pacific, the Japanese High Command found itself staring at a map that no longer resembled the empire they once controlled. The Central Pacific was gone. The South Pacific was gone. New Guinea was gone. The Marshalls, Gilberts, and Marianas, gone. Every bypassed island was dying. Every supply line was shattered. Every fortress was irrelevant. And America was not slowing down. They were accelerating. Next would come the Philippines. Then Okinawa. Then the home islands themselves. The empire Japan had spent decades building. Decades of harsh expansion, brutal conquest, unbroken confidence, was now being unraveled in a span of months by a strategy Japan had never anticipated, never prepared for, and never understood until it was too late. And as Japanese officers stood in silent despair over their maps, one by one they realized the unbearable truth. America was not just winning. America had rewritten the war itself. The Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean. It belonged now to the carriers, submarines, bombers, and marines who had crossed it step by step, island by island, until victory was no longer a question of if, but when. October 20th, 1944, early in the morning, as sheets of pale mist drifted across the waters off Leyte Gulf, the sky above the Philippines began to glow with the first amber light of dawn, revealing a sight unlike anything the Pacific had witnessed since the war began. An armada of American ships stretching from horizon to horizon, hundreds of vessels, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, carriers, moving steadily toward the heart of the Japanese Empire's last great defensive line. The sea vibrated with the thunder of engines, the steady march of iron and purpose pushing forward with absolute confidence. For the United States had now reached the stage of the war where island hopping had done more than shorten distances. It had carved a direct path into Japan's strategic core. The Marianas were secured, their runways humming with B-29 activity. The Marshalls and Gilberts were American outposts. Rabaul was isolated and irrelevant. And now, with the Philippines in sight, the U.S. was poised to sever the empire's most vital artery, the shipping routes that connected Japan to the oil fields of Southeast Asia. Without that oil, Japan could not fly, could not sail, could not fight. And the Japanese High Command knew it. October 20th, 1000 hours, as General Douglas MacArthur stepped onto Leyte's shore to proclaim his famed return, Japanese commanders in Tokyo stared in disbelief at the reports piling onto their tables. America had not attacked Taiwan, as expected. They had not slowed their advance after the Marianas. They had leaped, again, directly into the Philippines, forcing Japan into a naval confrontation of unprecedented scale. But unlike the early days of the war, Japan's navy was now a shadow of its former self. Their best pilots were gone. Their carriers were depleted. Their fuel reserves were critically low. Yet retreat was impossible. If they lost the Philippines, the empire would suffocate. And so, Japan committed what remained of its navy to what they themselves called the decisive battle, a last gamble to turn the tide. October 23rd, 1944, sunset, the battle began quietly, with radar operators aboard American destroyers detecting subtle echoes, submarines. Moments later, torpedoes sliced through the water, striking the Japanese cruiser Otago, flagship of Admiral Takeo Kurita. The ship erupted in flames, rolling onto its side as sailors plunged into the sea. 2 more cruisers were hit. Kurita survived, but the shock was immediate. Japan's last major fleet was being hunted before it even reached the battle zone. Still, Kurita pressed on. He had no choice. The Empire's fate depended on him. October 24th morning, as Kurita's battered fleet advanced through the Cebuon Sea, the sky darkened with the shadows of American aircraft launching wave after wave of attacks from carriers positioned hundreds of miles away. Dive bombers plummeted through clouds. Torpedo planes skimmed across the waves. Fighters escorted them like hawks guarding prey. The Japanese battleship Musashi, one of the largest and most powerful warships ever built, took dozens of hits, shuddering beneath explosions that tore open her armored deck. Fires spread. Compartments flooded. Yet the ship refused to die, pushing forward with monstrous determination until finally, after hours of punishment, she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the sea. Japan had lost a Titan, and America had lost nothing. The imbalance was unmistakable. Night fell, and with it came a deceptive calm over Leyte Gulf, a calm that shattered at dawn. October 25th, 1944. Early morning, the largest naval battle in modern history erupted across the Philippines in 3 separate engagements. To the north, Admiral Halsey chased a decoy Japanese carrier force, leaving a gap in the American defensive line. Through that gap, Admiral Kurita unexpectedly reappeared, his fleet battered but alive, charging directly toward a small, vulnerable group of American escort carriers and destroyers known as Taffy 3. What followed was one of the most desperate and heroic actions in naval warfare. Tiny destroyers, their guns barely capable of scratching a battleship, charged at Kurita's massive force anyway. Torpedoes roared through the waves. Smoke screens blossomed behind retreating ships. Pilots from the escort carriers, some without ammunition, dived at Japanese battleships just to buy seconds. Again and again, the small American ships hit above their weight, creating chaos among Kurita's formations. Kurita, convinced he was facing a full carrier task force, hesitated, then withdrew, unaware that victory had been within his grasp. And with that withdrawal, Japan's last chance to turn the tide disappeared forever. October 26th, midday, the surviving Japanese ships limped away, running low on ammunition and fuel. Their carrier force lay in ruins. Their submarines were sinking. Their pilots were gone. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had ended in a decisive American victory. And just like that, the Pacific shifted irreversibly. The Philippines were no longer a distant dream. They were now an inevitable conquest. November 1944. Across the islands, American forces carved their way inland. Villages turned into battlegrounds. Jungles burned under artillery fire. Japanese defenders fought from caves, cliffs, and bunkers, refusing to retreat. But island hopping had drained them before the fight even began. Reinforcements never arrived. Supplies never reached them. Their aircraft never gained control of the skies. And their ships, once symbols of Japanese naval supremacy, now rested at the bottom of the sea. December 1944. Early morning, American B-29s roared out of the Marianas, flying at altitudes too high for most Japanese fighters to intercept. Bombs rained down on industrial targets. Smoke engulfed the skies above Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. The war that once spanned oceans had finally reached Japan's doorstep. The empire had no shield left, and as these bombers roared overhead, Japan's leaders realized island hopping was never just a tactic. It was an unraveling, a methodical stripping away of every strategic advantage they once held. One island at a time, one airfield at a time, one supply line at a time. Now, with the Philippines falling and the home front burning, the Japanese High Command faced a truth they had tried to ignore since Guadalcanal. America had mastered a new kind of warfare, one Japan had neither predicted nor prepared for. January 1945. Dusk. American forces pushed northward, closing in on Manila. Japanese troops, trapped and isolated, launched last-stand defenses across the city, but the outcome was assured. Outside Japan's remaining strongholds, American submarines cut through convoys with deadly efficiency. Tankers exploded in flames. Cargo ships vanished beneath the waves. Food shortages swept across Japan. Fuel reserves dwindled to days, then hours. Training flights were reduced. Ships remained anchored. Trucks sat abandoned. The empire built for conquest could no longer move, and as the Philippines fell, Japan's power collapsed with it, piece by irretrievable piece. February 1945. Twilight. The Americans secured Manila. The Philippines were effectively back in Allied hands, and from the decks of American carriers, from the control rooms of submarines, from the runways of the Marianas, one thing was now unmistakable: the road to Japan was open. The strategy Japan never expected, the strategy they never understood, had now turned the full force of the war toward their homeland, and the empire that once believed it would dominate the Pacific now found itself watching the approach of an enemy they could no longer stop. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave, and Japan was standing directly in its path. March 1, 1945. Early in the morning, as the first pale streaks of sunlight crawled over the vast Pacific, the American war machine moved with a momentum Japan could no longer match. Each wave of ships, aircraft, and troops driven by a strategy that had already reshaped the entire conflict: island hopping. The Philippines were falling. U.S. submarines severed Japan's lifelines. B-29s roared overhead, delivering destruction with a precision the empire had never imagined possible. And now the advance pushed toward the next stepping stones: Iwo Jima and Okinawa, two islands whose names would soon become synonymous with a final approach toward Japan itself. But the truth beneath these massive operations was far simpler. Japan was running out of time. Their oil reserves were nearly gone. Aircraft production had slowed. Their once feared fleet was reduced to fragments scattered across shrinking waters. Yet the defenders on these islands held a conviction forged from desperation. Each island must be held at any cost, not because it would stop America, but because losing them meant the home islands were next. March 5. Midday, American reconnaissance flights swept over Iwo Jima, their cameras capturing the volcanic terraces, tunnel systems, and defensive positions carved deep into the landscape. Japanese commanders had transformed the island into a fortress, knowing full well what its loss meant. B-29 bombers returning from Japan would have a safe place to land, and fighter escorts could now accompany bombers deeper into the Empire's skies. Even before the first landing craft touched the black volcanic sand, the Japanese High Command understood that an unbroken chain was forming, from Hawaii to the Marshalls, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, from the Marianas to Iwo Jima, and once that chain reached Japan, there would be nowhere left to retreat. March 19, afternoon. The island fell after bitter combat, and the first damaged B-29s began landing on its makeshift runways, their crews stepping onto solid ground with a mixture of relief and awe. This was why island hopping worked. Every island captured amplified the strength of every operation that followed. Every airfield taken reduced Japan's defensive perimeter. Every supply route cut deepened the Empire's isolation. And as the Americans turned their eyes toward Okinawa, the final and largest obstacle before the home islands, the sense of inevitability spread across both sides of the war. April 1, 1945, early morning, the sky over Okinawa flickered with the reflections of sunlight off thousands of ships, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Troop transports moved steadily toward shore. Battleships rumbled in the distance. Carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft. But something was different now. Japan no longer had a unified defensive line. Their remaining aircraft were few. Their navy could no longer mount a decisive counterattack. Instead, Okinawa became a desperate defensive struggle, one Japan hoped would buy enough time for diplomats to find an impossible path toward negotiated peace. Yet as American forces advanced across the island, a new and terrifying element entered the war: kamikaze attacks, pilots who launched themselves at American ships with the belief that sacrifice might slow the inevitable. The attacks damaged vessels, set decks ablaze, created moments of chaos, but they could not stop the momentum. They could not halt the carriers. They could not break the logistics stream flowing endlessly from America's mainland. The U.S. Navy patched the ships, replaced the aircraft, reorganized the fleets, and continued forward. Island hopping had collapsed Japan's ability to wage a sustained defense. They were fighting courageously, but alone. May 1945, dusk, Okinawa's battle neared its end. American air superiority was now absolute. Convoys from Japan dwindled almost to nothing. Entire divisions were stranded. Food shortages spread. Civilians faced hardships that rippled across every island. And yet, even with the empire crumbling, Japan's leadership refused to surrender. They pinned their hopes on one final belief: if the United States attacked the home islands directly, the casualties would be so immense that America would negotiate. They did not understand, could not understand, that island hopping had been designed specifically to avoid such a catastrophe. America never intended to fight on every beach and every hill. They had bypassed entire strongholds. They had isolated entire armies. And now, for the first time in the war, American strategists considered bypassing the home islands themselves, not by occupation, but by new weapons that could end the conflict without invading. June 1945, late evening, as American forces secured Okinawa, the war entered a silent countdown. B-29s flew daily missions over Japan. Cities burned. Factories collapsed. Transportation networks failed. And the Japanese leadership sat in dim war rooms, exhausted, divided, clinging to a vision of a war already lost. But outside those rooms, the truth was written across the Pacific. America's path from island to island had built an unbroken corridor of bases, fuel depots, shipyards, and airstrips, all pointing directly toward Japan's heart. The empire that once stretched across half the Pacific now stood cornered by a strategy they never predicted. Island hopping had never been about territory. It was about positioning, momentum, and inevitability. And now, inevitability had arrived. July 1945 morning, from the island of Tinian, B-29 crews trained for missions unlike any before. Officers spoke in vague terms. Ground crewmen prepared aircraft with secrecy. Across the Pacific, whispers spread. Something new was coming. Something decisive. Something final. But even before history revealed the nature of that weapon, Japan was already collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins. The navy was gone. Air power had evaporated. Soldiers on distant islands still fought, unaware that the war's outcome had already been decided not by any single battle, but by the strategy that had led America here step by relentless step. August 1945. Dawn. The world changed. A single bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. 2 cities erased. 2 shockwaves that shattered the Japanese belief that they could negotiate, endure, or resist. The empire that had once dreamed of dominating Asia now bowed under the weight of unimaginable destruction. And on August 15, 1945, Japan finally surrendered. The war was over. Yet as the world celebrated, historians began asking the same question. How did America cross an ocean ruled by Japan? How did an empire once feared for its naval strength collapse so completely? How did the United States advance so rapidly, so decisively, with losses far lower than predicted. The answer was not a single weapon or single commander. It was the strategy that shaped everything: island hopping, the plan that allowed the US to dismantle Japan not by overwhelming force, but by calculated precision, isolating strongholds, avoiding unwinnable battles, and striking where it mattered most. In doing so, America bypassed years of bloodshed, redirected the course of the war, and reshaped the future of military strategy forever. And as the veterans of those campaigns grew old and the memories of the Pacific faded into history, one truth remained unshakable: Japan expected a brutal island-by-island invasion. But America had a different plan, one they never saw coming, one that ended the war, one that changed the world. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.